Hello everybody, my name is Amanda. I am a hand embroidery artist and I run this channel mainly to help inspire others and teach them the art of embroidery. This video is going to be a little bit different. I've really been enjoying doing a little bit of sit down videos and just kind of talking through a technique or an opinion, which is what this is going to be. But today I just wanted to share some unpopular opinions I have about embroidery. I just thought this would be a fun video to spark some conversation. It's definitely not meant to put down any sort of style of embroidery or anything like that. It's just there's a lot of opinions and also best practices with embroidery, and I just thought it'd be interesting to kind of share what I like and don't like and some of the opinions I have about certain things. So let's get into it. Number one, I really don't like the satin stitch. This may be an opinion that other people share with me. I've seen some discussion about it over the internet, but I have just never really enjoyed doing it. I get really bored with it, and this is coming from someone that thread paints. Like, I could do the long and short stitch all day long, but something about the satin stitch is so I don't like it. I don't know. I use it in things sometimes, but it's not my first pick for a stitch. Obviously, I usually just opt for a long and short stitch for filling in areas, and I just kind of steer clear of satin stitch unless I truly need it. I kind of feel like, and you guys can correct me if I'm wrong, but I feel like you either love it or you hate it. There's like no in between. It can be really hard to get satin stitches to lay really neatly. I have tried all the tricks. I have improved the quality of my stitches to a point where I'm like not embarrassed about it, but there are some stitchers that just make it look so smooth and perfect, and it's crazy. I've just never been able to do that. I think it's mainly because I am kind of a fast stitcher and I don't like to slow down with certain things, so I think that I may rush through it a little bit too much, so that might be part of it. But again, it just kind of stems from me being a little bit bored with it. Like, I don't know. I just have never really liked it. So let me know if you like the satin stitch. Definitely a useful stitch, but not my first pick. This next opinion, I think a lot of people that do cross stitch are going to hate me for, but I love to start and end my embroidery stitches with knots, and I do it probably a majority of the time. I sometimes will use an away knot or tuck the tail in of the thread underneath the stitches. I would say I probably do that like 25% of the time, but for the most part, I just kind of taught myself to do embroidery that way, and I have never really felt like it's hurt my embroidery. I think that if you make too large of knots on the back, it can disturb your embroidery on the front, but I tend to use a quilter's knot, which you can control the size of pretty well. So I feel like the knots are pretty low profile and they don't disturb anything. I think it's mainly from doing client work. I just worry that something's gonna come undone, which I don't even think the chances of it are that high, honestly, but whenever I'm doing pet portraits or anything like that, I'm really careful to make sure I'm securing everything really well. So I think that's where that habit kind of formed. But a lot of people hate knots and they're like, do not knot your work. It will show in the back. It will disturb your stitches. I think I've just kind of figured out a system that works for me. But yeah, I would say about 75% of the time I use knots on the back of my work, and it probably looks kind of messy. That leads me into my next opinion, which is number 3. I don't really care that much about how the back of my embroidery work looks. I think this is also an opinion that's very polarizing with people. I think some people are like, it needs to look really, really neat. And then other people are like, it looks like a chaotic mess on the back. And I think I'm kind of in between that. I am careful to not carry my stitches too far and too much, because it can kind of warp the fabric when you do that. But for the most part, I would say the backs of my embroideries are kind of messy, and I think it's just mainly because I use knots and also because I just don't care that much about it. I actually am in the process of making a video of some tips for keeping the back of your embroidery neat. Even though I don't do what I say, I do know some techniques to help. And I do also think it just kind of depends on what you're working on. So sometimes when you are working on a piece of clothing, or you're working on something where you're going to see the back of the embroideries from time to time on a linen, like a tablecloth or a tea towel or something, I think it's more important to do stuff like that. But if you're doing something that you are gonna cover the back with fabric, if you're displaying it in a hoop or framing it or anything like that, as long as you're not creating a bunch of bulk on the back, I don't really think it matters. And I think it looks kind of cool that way. So again, it's not a super hard and fast opinion I have. It's just something I don't really care about that much unless it's truly something I need to care about. One tip that I have, if you are kind of a messy stitcher on the back, if you have ever tried to frame your embroidery and back it with some fabric and you feel like the stitches are showing through on the front, you can actually use a darker shade of fabric on the back. This happens a lot with beige or white fabric. I wouldn't use anything that's a super loud color, but if you use something that's like a deeper color and a little bit darker, it can sometimes camouflage some of the stitches that are showing through. So try that out. I think it helps a lot. And that way you can still stitch as messy as you want, and then you can just cover the back up and it's fine. This next tip is probably the most controversial tip that I will say on here, but I love a good floral embroidery, but I think they're a little overrated. I just think there's just so many other cool subject matter to stitch. So personally, I like to stitch stuff like animals and incorporate botanicals and flowers in them, but I find just stitching flowers all the time super boring. Some people love it, and that this is not to like hate on anybody or judge anybody, because it's not like that at all. I just personally get really bored with them for some reason. I think when I'm really studying the composition or the positioning of an animal, it's just way more interesting to me because most of my work is thread painting. So I feel like it's just more of a challenge for me that way. Not to say that flowers are not challenging, they get kind of monotonous to me. I started creating patterns that I wanted to see in the world that I just couldn't quite find what I wanted. And that's kind of what led me down the path of stitching more subject matter that's like animals and other kinds of things as well. So yeah, love me some flowers sometimes, but I don't stitch them all the time. This next opinion is kind of a specific and random one, but I get a lot of questions from people about what I cover my embroideries on the back with when I stitch on clothing, and I just don't. Like, I just have never really felt like I needed to. Like, a lot of people normally cover it. So there's this stuff called Tender Touch, which is a stabilizer, and I think it's iron-on. I actually have some that I've been meaning to test out. I just haven't gotten around to it. Maybe I'll like it. Maybe my opinion will change. But I have just never had any issues with my embroidery stitches falling out because I'm just so particular about like triple knotting everything on the back. And I'm also really careful. This is the one time I'm really careful about not being super messy on the back of my embroideries. So I really try not to carry the stitches or anything like that, because when you do that, it can, once the tension is off of it and it's out of the hoop, your stitches can sag and kind of come out. So I am really mindful of how I do things. So I think that maybe that's partly why I just don't really see the necessity in backing it. I think the one reason you'd want to put backing on it is if you're wearing something and it's really scratchy. But I personally have washed my embroidered clothing a bunch. It softens a little bit, and I've never had any issues with it falling out. So yeah, I never really have felt like I needed to. This last opinion is also one that's probably a little bit harsh, but I just don't really like to frame my embroideries in hoops as much as I used to. I do it a lot because I make a lot of patterns, but I feel like those patterns could easily be stitched onto clothing. It's just easier for me to stitch something in a hoop in like a smaller form than having a bunch of fabric all the time. But I personally, this is why I don't like it as much. I think that there's just so much utility with embroidery. I would argue it's more versatile even than painting or something, because you're able to stitch on clothing, you're able to stitch on accessories like a hair bow or make a hairband or a book corner. You can do all of these really cool things with it. So I just feel like there's so many cool things to do besides just boringly stitching it in a hoop and displaying it. I know that there's a time and place for that, but this year I've been trying to explore different ways to use my embroideries. The other reason is I personally think it cheapens the perceived value of something, which sucks, but it is what it is. Embroidery, I think, is seen as more of a craft form than an art form, and that's like a whole different conversation. I personally believe that embroidery is an art form in itself, and it's obviously rooted in craft, but there's just like so much you can do with it, and you can literally make art with it. So I feel like it's just as good as any other art medium. I don't know if that's an unpopular opinion, but I hold a pretty strong opinion on that. But I think that an embroidery hoop, for some reason, cheapens the perceived value. And I think lately I've been trying to explore other ways of displaying embroidery art. So like if it's not a utilitarian piece, then I'm looking into ways that I could maybe frame it or stretch it over a canvas or something like that. So I would love to make some videos exploring some other ways to frame embroidery. I just haven't found the time to do them yet, but I really do want to do that soon, because that way you could frame it in a frame instead of just putting it in a hoop. People perceive that as more valuable for some reason. Is that right? I don't know, but I think that it looks cool if you can find a vintage frame or an antique frame or get it custom framed. So it's something I'd like to explore in the future, so we'll see. As of right now, those are my opinions that I hold that I can think of off the top of my head. I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and please let me know what your unpopular opinions are. I'd love to start a discussion about these things. These are just opinions that I hold. Obviously, not everyone else holds these opinions, so I just love to hear what other people think. If you like embroidery and you'd like to continue watching videos like this, as well as stitch tutorials and technique tutorials, please consider liking and subscribing, and I'll see you in the next one. All right, bye.